This is Jurius Doctor of Eve University. I'm just doing a little exploring right now, sailing around in my stealth bomber. I was doing some Purity of the Throne sites in this area, and I decided to come take a closer look at the Jove Observatory in the system. Presently I'm in Dastrans. And one of the things I'd noticed was that, about 3 years ago when I started playing the game was around Rubicon dropped. And Jove observatories had started to appear around that time. And yeah, they looked damaged. And a lot of the Jove observatories looked like they'd seen some failures internally and were starting to break down. But I've recently noticed that the amount of damage to these incredible structures has recently increased. They're showing an incredible amount of damage in a lot of these models, and some of them it outright looks like the tops of them are like exploded and are breaking off. And we can see sort of inside the model here a little bit more. And it is it's kind of interesting to see what's going on internally in these to say what is happening with these, that they are either exploding or if somebody is attacking them, indeed who's attacking them. So I thought it was worth taking a closer look at this. Now, for the members of Arek'jaalan and a few people in Eve with whom I've spoken, like Mark726 of Eve Travel, they're all familiar with my theory, which is that from a mechanics level, the Player Built Stargate thread has never been shelved. That news originally came out back in the days of Rubicon, and it was supposed to be one of those things that people would follow a series of events or a story arc that would lead to the components that you needed to build a Player Built Stargate dropping. My theory is that if you look at the lore going back on what happens when you use an Entosis link on Jove Observatories, you get a little snippet of a log from them. One of the members of the Arek'jaalan community has actually done a really, really good job of putting together sort of a complete analysis of what each of those logs has said so far. I don't think anybody's updated it in at least a year, so there's probably new information to be gleaned from the Jove Observatories. But I have a strong suspicion that the scope events, the drifter caches, the hives, the sleepers, the ghost sites, they all play into this greater story arc. And some of the drops that don't have a lot of utility but have very descriptive notes about them within the description box for those items, they all have parts to play in the construction of player-built Stargates. That's my theory, at least. And more interestingly than that, I think that there's some pretty obvious uses for some of these items. So, Artemis and Hecanta protect the hive vaults, and those each drop what has been sometimes called a radioactive bread, or elements that you have to pick up. Let's see if I can find out how much those are going for on the market right now. So here's an example of one. This is the conflux element. The description for each of these, the Barbican, Sentinel, conflux, they all have basically the same description. This strange, unreal aspect of this element, or of this object, plays havoc with your mind. The distortion is interfering with signal reception and hindering decryption. Despite this, one strong repetitive motif is breaking through the chaos, a single repeating concept. Conflux. My theory about these items is that they are both a power source and a locator. That there are that these are tied to potential new regions of space, and that the signal that they're giving off is kind of like they're acting as an anchor, meaning like lighting up a cyno. These, have sort of that same resonance or focus within them, so that if you use these as a power source for a Stargate, you have the potential to tie that signal to the destination gate. Kind of like in the show Stargate, where they had this, 6-axis coordinates system describing your destination system. Was a plot between these 6 stars in a constellation or in a series of constellations in space. Except, what if these elements, Conflux, Barbican, Sentinel, all these different ones, what if they have a signal or a concept built into them that links them to a destination system? Now, we know that in the last couple of years, CCP has done quite a great job of updating the processing capacity and the data center systems of the servers that run Eve, and they're making a lot of changes to optimize how Eve renders and processes things, like the fact that fighters for carriers work much more efficiently on a computing level than drones, because drones are rendered as individual objects, and the servers have to keep track of where all of those individual objects are, whereas a squad of fighters has a certain number of hit points per unit in it, and as you wear down that group of fighters, individual fighters in that group die as the unit shrinks until you eventually kill it. It's actually much easier to calculate for that than to render the hundreds and hundreds of drones that every pilot flying a drone boat is launching every second in the game throughout Eve space. It's a huge computational load. So by cleaning that stuff up, there's a lot of opportunity for them to use that compute elsewhere. And I think one of the things that the long game has always been to do is, how do we expand Eve beyond the systems that are presently existent within Eve? How do they open up to things like Jove space? And I think part of the whole Player Built Stargate arc that's been progressing over the last 3 years, and will probably take another 2 years to come to fruition, or maybe sooner, is that these elements will function as a power source and as a beacon or an anchor to tie those player-built stargates to the new regions of space. And then once those first initial few have been built, opening up contact and encounters with new factions and new types of enemies, that the overall arc will progress into players being able to build player-built stargates. And that technology as deployables will make it possible for players to not only expand into new regions of space, but to have a greater degree of control over what we call core space. And I think if you follow the lore about how the drifters have changed, the battleships are now easier to kill, that the drifters are definitely very active. They've killed Empress Jamal Sarum. Their observatories are now falling apart or are potentially self-destructing. I have sort of a hunch that perhaps what's happening is that these are breaking down because their purpose has been served. And what we may see as a progression of the Defense of the Throne Worlds arc from a little while ago is that the drifters are going to start invading and start attacking space in greater numbers, and they're going to be a regular faction that you can fight, and eventually that BPCs will drop for drifter frigates, drifter cruisers, and drifter battleships. That they will be like the Apprentice and the Guristas. But they will be, just another group that we're able to engage with in space. And, I mean, even Eve Travel, if you look through his blog, Mark does a great job of identifying the changes in sites. Specifically, there was a a data site in the rooms in the hive complex where a bunch of what looked like array antennas kind of clustered together into a group like a sea urchin, just a ball of spikes. And at the center was a very anomalous cluster of signals that your ship, couldn't really make sense of, and there was a spatial distortion above and below it. And if you look at a lot of the hive sites, a lot of the sleeper caches, a lot of those different sites, there's these big ring-shaped objects in space that bear a pretty strong resemblance to something like a Stargate or a Player Built Stargate. So, or what you might imagine a Player Built Stargate would look like if it was being designed by the Jovians. So these sites have gone through changes over time. That big signal array has since exploded, and now it's just a field of wrecked beams and arcing electricity. Just as the Jove observatories have been slowly coming apart and exploding. And drifters have been a lot more aggressive, but they are also now easier to kill. So there's some big changes happening in Eve, and I'm excited to see where these are going. But I think that there's a lot more investigation to be done, and I don't think that people should be giving up on the idea of having stargates connecting them to their fortizars. Thanks very much for listening in, and again, this is Jurius Doctor, teacher and event staff with Eve University.